This is Augustine's Epistemology, presented by Rachel Cullen, Spring 2022, PHS 611, Logic and Epistemology with Dr. Philippe Yates. So this is just a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to start with the biography of St. Augustine, then I'm going to move on to faith and the role that it played in his development of his epistemology of knowledge. Then we're going to go over his theory of knowledge. Next, we'll move to the will and its role in knowledge, as well as humility, and then we'll finally summarize it up in the conclusion. So St. Augustine was the Bishop of Hippo. He is a doctor of the Catholic Church. He was born on the 13th of November in 354 and lived until August 28th of 430. His most influential works are the Confessions and the City of God. He represents the most influential adaptation of the ancient Platonic tradition, and he shaped the practice of biblical exegesis and helped lay the foundation for much of Christian thought. We're going to start with faith because it's absolutely central to the way that Augustine is thinking and his epistemology. He starts from the position of there being a God. The big issue for Augustine is that he struggled with the problem of evil. And this was really driven by the law of non-contradiction. If there was a good God, then how could there be evil in the world? So to deal with this, he ended up slipping into Manichaeism when he was a teenager. This is a dualist Gnostic religious cult, and it centered around the teaching of Mani, who was a semi-messianic figure who claimed to be the fulfillment of all previous prophets, specifically Adam, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus Christ. Mani claimed that his teachings were the completion of all of these various religions and that it was the full revelation of knowledge. The core beliefs of Manichaeism were that good and evil are equal powers. This is that dualism. All that is spirit is like God and thus good, and therefore all that is material is bad. At the end of time, the world would return to its original duality, so complete separation of good and evil. Knowledge was found in the soul, which was like God, so there's a lot of internal introspection, and knowledge was the only way to salvation. So this broke down into two groups. First, there was the elect, and this was the core group. They were committed to a missionary life of poverty and celibacy. They were strict vegetarians, drank no wines, and were forbidden to even harvest or prepare food. Then there were the hearers, and these individuals incurred the sin of preparing food and were released from sin by the prayers of the elect who ate it. So they essentially served the elect. They were allowed a wife or a concubine, but procreation was forbidden because it trapped the divine spirit in matter. Augustine was a hearer for 9 years and allowed him to continue living his life as he wanted to. He could blame all of his deficits on his evil material nature, shirking all of his personal responsibility. Then came the death of his best friend, and this led to a crisis of faith. He ended up leaving Manichaeism, and this is when he converted to Catholicism. He started seeing things as a whole and not simply as parts. St. Ambrose was instrumental in helping convert Augustine, and he helped Augustine take another look at the Bible that he had been raised with and see that it could be taken figuratively and not simply literally. And Augustine ended up moving on to see that evil was a privation of good, so no longer a dualistic mindset. So theory of knowledge. So Augustine's theory of knowledge really starts when he left Manichaeism and went over to academic skepticism. He ended up developing this because he found himself slipping into despair. So his mission ended up being, hey, can we know? So he set out to prove that truth is attainable and knowledge and wisdom are possible. He did this by showing the certainty of self-referential knowledge, the certainty of private or subjective knowledge, and the certainty of formal, logical, mathematical structures. From this, it said he established what we kind of recognize as the Augustine cogito. This is where Hume is seen to have taken his form of the cogito, I think, therefore I am. But essentially, it was an area that Augustine established as immune to skeptical doubt by inferring from my awareness of my existence the truth of the proposition I exist. The conclusion: even if maximal concessions are made concerning the unknowability of the external world attainable by the senses, an internal area of cognition remains. It is this area of cognition that allows for and guarantees certainty, therefore truth is possible. So how do we know? Augustine calls this the illumination. This is specifically a non-empiricist argument, and it is based on Plato's doctrine of recollection. It starts a priori with recognizing that God is the condition, possibility, and criterion of intellectual insight due to his nature of being both immanent and transcendent. Augustine claimed that true knowledge requires first-hand acquaintance, and we obtain that knowledge through objects of two different kinds. First is the sensible, which these objects do not emit knowledge, we only form an opinion about them, and this is done through sense perception. And then second is the intelligible, and these objects cannot be reached empirically via abstraction, nor can they be transferred linguistically by a human teacher. They are only the product of a personal intellectual activity that results in intellectual insight. The examples for this, again, are math, logic, and moral intuition. So the illumination is the application of Platonic forms in conjunction with Christian theology. So we come to know information, or we come through to cognition through two different mediums, the inner teacher and the illumination. So Christ is the teacher that is present in our soul and presides over them like a teacher that guarantees the truthfulness of our understanding. And the illumination is provided by God. So God is intelligible himself and illumines the intelligible objects as to enable reason to activate its capacity for intellection. So the role of the human mind in all of this, and this is where we see Augustine starting to take the parts of dualism and bring them back together, matter and spirit. So the human mind was created by God to be connected with and with a capacity to see intelligible in light of intelligible truth. Capacity in this sense implies an implicit or latent knowledge of moral and epistemological standards, and human knowledge is not completely dependent on divine agency, and this is because we are getting things from our sense perception, but the cognition is not the result of Christ's presence in our soul, but from consulting the inner teacher. Which we move to the role of the human will. Cognition is made possible by our testing of propositions that claim to convey a truth about the intelligible reality against the inner standards we possess thanks to the presence of Christ. So the role of the will, and this I thought summed up Augustine's thought processes really perfectly. And it is taken from the De Magisterio, or the teacher, and it is a conversation that he is having with his son. But as for all those things which we understand, it is not an outward sound of the speaker's words that we consult, but the truth which presides over the mind itself from within, though we may have been led to consult it because of the words. Now he who is consulted and he who is said to dwell in the inner man, it is who teaches is namely Christ. That is to say, the unchangeable power of God and everlasting wisdom. This is the wisdom which every rational soul does indeed consult, but it reveals itself to each according to his capacity to grasp it by reason of the good or evil dispositions of his will. And if the soul is sometimes mistaken, this does not come about because of any deficit on the part of truth it consulted, just as it is not through any deficit in the light outside of us that our bodily eyes are often deceived. We acknowledge that it is this light which we consult with regard to visible objects, so that it may manifest them to us according to our capacity to receive them. So what is the will? So Augustine is credited with being one of the first ones to discover or really investigate the will. He basically presents it as a faculty of choice that is neither reducible to reason nor rational desire. It's a constitutive element of the mind, and it's closely related to love and is the locus of moral evaluation. Claims love and will are features of the rational mind, and therefore it is impossible to talk about free will without grace. He often uses love synonymously with the will. So there are two movements of the will as driven by love. The first is positively towards God, and the second is negatively towards ourself or a corporal creature. But at this point that I want to bring in St. Thomas Aquinas and look at what he had to say about the two virtue, or the virtue of humility and the vice of pride. And it's really helps round out St. Augustine's position on this, and especially helpful because St. Thomas Aquinas really built off of a lot of what St. Augustine had said. So negative love is the result of pride, which is, in its basic definition, an inordinate self-love. Aquinas says that it's a special sin and it's a defect of the intellect, and therefore it results in movements towards the self. So going back to what Augustine had said, and that knowledge is really dependent on the will, it seems that knowledge is dependent on a will that is ordered to love of God. So in the positive sense, love is a force in our soul that attracts us to the beauty we find nowhere else but in and above ourselves. It drives us to ascend from the sensible to the intelligible world into the cognition and contemplation of God. So with this, it is humility that makes knowledge of one's deficiency possible. And it's especially beautiful because that humility is the exact opposite of pride. Humility is considered a special virtue. It resides in the soul as an aspect of faith and a sub-virtue of temperance and justice. I also read that it is often said to be the queen of the virtues. So in this, virtue is really ordered love, and it is that ordered love of the will that is allowing knowledge to even be obtained. In conclusion, knowledge is the product of conformity of the human mind with the divine intellect. This is due to the grace of faith through the special grace of humility, and it is maintained through virtue, the ordered love of God.